January 16th, 1945. The sky over Suchin airfield in southern China hung heavy with smoke and the distant rumble of artillery. Major Yasuhiko Kuroe stood beside the grounded American fighter, his hands resting on its sleek metal skin, still warm from the emergency landing. The paint shimmered in the afternoon light, unmarked except for the bullet holes that had forced it down. On the fuselage, painted in careful script, was a name: Evalina. The pilot, a young American lieutenant named Sam McMillan, had already been taken away by guards. His hands were bound, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. He expected torture, imprisonment, perhaps execution under the Enemy Airmen's Act that had condemned so many Allied flyers to death. What he could not have known was that his aircraft, this silver machine that bore his squadron mate's girlfriend's name, would soon reveal a truth more devastating to the Japanese than any bomb. Kuroe circled the P-51 Mustang slowly, studying every line, every panel, every rivet. He was a 30-victory ace, a combat veteran who had flown against the Americans since Malaya, through Burma, across the skies of China. He had faced lightnings and thunderbolts, warhawks and wildcats, but the Mustang was different. It had appeared over the front lines like a ghost, faster than anything Japan could field, able to escort bombers deeper into the heart of Japanese-controlled territory than anyone had thought possible. Now, standing before one intact, he felt something unfamiliar. Not fear exactly, but a creeping unease that whispered a question he did not want to ask. What if everything he had been told about American inferiority was a lie? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The orders came swiftly. Paint over the American stars with Hinomaru roundels, prepare the aircraft for flight, deliver it to the Army Air Inspection Center at Fusa. Near Tokyo, Kuroe would be the one to fly it. As ground crews worked to repair minor damage and apply Japanese markings, he watched in silence. The Mustang's lines were unlike anything in the Japanese arsenal. Where the Ki-84 and Ki-61 had angular, aggressive profiles, this aircraft seemed to flow. Every surface, designed not just for function, but for efficiency. The belly scoop that cooled the Merlin engine sat flush against the fuselage, creating almost no drag. No oil streaked from the cowling, no fuel stained the wings. One of the mechanics, a veteran named Sergeant Watanabe, ran his hand along the wing and murmured, "It doesn't leak." The other men stopped and stared. Every Japanese aircraft leaked. Oil from the engine, hydraulic fluid from the landing gear, fuel from poorly sealed tanks. It was simply accepted as the cost of flight. But this machine, built in a factory in Texas, assembled by workers Kuroe would never meet, did not leak a single drop. That night, before the flight to Japan, Kuroe sat alone in the operations hut, studying intelligence reports on the P-51. Range: over 1,000 miles with drop tanks. Speed: 440 miles per hour at altitude. Armament: 6 50 caliber machine guns with over 1,600 rounds. Pilot armor: thick steel plate, protecting the seat and head. Radio equipment: direction finding capability, multiple frequencies, crystal clear transmission. He compared the numbers to Japan's finest, the Ki-84 Hayate. Similar speed, similar armament, but the Mustang could fly twice as far, and its equipment was a generation ahead. The report concluded with a single line that felt like a blade pressed against his throat. If the Americans capture Iwo Jima, these aircraft will be able to reach the homeland. Kuroe closed the folder and stared out the window at the Mustang, now wearing the rising sun on its wings. In 3 days, he would fly it. In 3 days, he would know the truth, and he suspected, with the certainty of a man who had survived too many battles to believe in comforting lies, that the truth would be worse than any propaganda had prepared him for. The morning of January 19th dawned cold and clear. Kuroe climbed into the Mustang's cockpit, settling into the seat with a cautious reverence. The space was larger than any Japanese fighter he had flown. His knees did not press against the instrument panel. His shoulders had room to move. The seat itself was padded, adjustable, designed for comfort on long missions. Behind his head, thick armor plate curved protectively around the pilot's position. He tapped it with his knuckle. Solid, heavy. American pilots flew into battle wrapped in steel. The instrument panel gleamed with clarity. Every gauge was labeled in English, but the layout was intuitive. Altimeter, airspeed, fuel, oil pressure, manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature. A direction-finding radio sat to his right, its dial marked with compass headings. He toggled the radio switch and heard the crackle of static, clear and strong. Japanese radios, when they worked at all, hissed and sputtered with interference. This one sounded like a voice speaking directly into his ear. He primed the engine, set the mixture, and engaged the starter. The Packard-built Merlin coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a deep, powerful growl that vibrated through the entire airframe. No misfires, no hesitation. He advanced the throttle slightly and felt the aircraft surge forward with eager responsiveness. The tail came up easily as he taxied, the visibility over the nose far better than the long-nosed Ki-61 he had trained new pilots on. At the end of the runway, he ran through the checks one final time. Flaps down, trim set, mixture rich. He released the brakes and pushed the throttle forward. The acceleration was immediate and relentless. The Mustang leaped down the runway, eating distance with a hunger that shocked him. At 90 miles per hour, he pulled back gently on the stick, and the aircraft lifted into the air as if it had been waiting all along to return to the sky. The climb rate was extraordinary. Kuroe banked east toward Japan, watching the airspeed settle at 280 miles per hour in cruise. He was barely using half throttle. He pushed the throttle forward and felt the aircraft surge ahead, the airspeed needle climbing past 350, then 400. The Mustang wasn't flying. It was cutting through the air like a sword through silk. He tested a turn, rolling into a gentle bank. The controls were light, responsive, perfectly balanced. He tightened the turn, pulling harder, and the Mustang responded without hesitation, carving through the sky with a grace that bordered on supernatural. This was not the brutal, muscular agility of a Zero or the heavy, determined strength of a Thunderbolt. This was precision, engineering, art. Hours passed. The fuel gauge barely moved. He flew over the East China Sea, the waters below glittering in the afternoon sun, and allowed himself a moment of terrible clarity. This was what Japan was fighting. Not just an enemy with more pilots or more factories, an enemy with better machines, better equipment, better everything. By the time the coast of Japan appeared on the horizon, Kuroe had stopped trying to find faults in the Mustang. There were none that mattered. It was faster than anything Japan could field. It could fly farther. It was better armed, better protected, better equipped. And if the Americans could build these by the thousands, as intelligence suggested they could, then the war was already over. Japan just didn't know it yet. He landed at Fusa as the sun dipped below the mountains, the Mustang touching down with the gentle precision of a bird returning to its nest. As the engine spun down and silence returned, Kuroe sat in the cockpit for a long moment, his hands still gripping the controls. Ground crews rushed forward, officers shouted questions, but he heard none of it. He was thinking of the young American pilot, Sam McMillan, now imprisoned somewhere in the north. That man had expected torture. Instead, his aircraft was about to torture every Japanese pilot who flew against it by revealing a truth they could no longer deny. 3 days after landing at Suchin, Kuroe climbed out of the Mustang at Fusa and wrote his first evaluation report. His handwriting was careful, measured, as though the words themselves carried weight. I was astonished with its performance. Turn characteristics were splendid, almost the same as the Ki-84 in a horizontal turn. The radio transmitter was excellent. The armament and other miscellaneous equipment was very good, particularly when compared with their Japanese equivalents. And moreover, it had a radio direction finder. He paused, pen hovering over the page, then added the line that would define everything that followed. I had such confidence with this P-51 that I feared no Japanese fighters. The headquarters at Fusa fell silent when they read those words. An ace with 30 victories, a man who had fought the Allies across half of Asia, was saying that he would rather fly the enemy's aircraft than his own. The implications were catastrophic. If one Mustang, flown by a Japanese pilot, could dominate Japan's finest fighters, what would happen when hundreds of them appeared over Tokyo? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. On April 7, 1945, just weeks after Kuroe's evaluation, 96 P-51 Mustangs escorted B-29 superfortresses over the Japanese homeland for the first time. They had launched from Iwo Jima, the volcanic island that American Marines had taken at terrible cost. The distance was 750 miles, impossible for any fighter Japan possessed, but not for the Mustang. Kuroe watched from the ground as the formations passed overhead, silver specks glinting in the high-altitude sun. Somewhere up there, Japanese pilots were discovering what he already knew. The Americans had come to stay. The testing at Fusa continued for weeks. Evalina was flown in mock combat against the Ki-43 Oscar, the Ki-61 Tony, the Ki-84 Frank. Every Japanese pilot who faced the Mustang came away shaken. The Oscar, nimble and lightweight, could not match its speed. The Tony, sleek and modern, could not match its range. The Frank, Japan's finest fighter, could barely keep pace in a dive and was hopelessly outmatched in equipment. One pilot, a young lieutenant named Nakamura, landed after a mock engagement and climbed out of his Ki-100 trembling. "It toyed with us," he said quietly. "We had altitude, we had position, and it still got behind us." His squadron commander, Captain Masashi Sumita, nodded grimly. He had flown against Kuroe in the Mustang twice. Both times, the engagement had ended the same way. The Mustang climbed, dove, and maneuvered with such effortless superiority that resistance felt futile. Sumita later recalled, "Major Kuroe taught us how to take our aircraft out of the P-51's axis when being chased, but his lessons began with a warning. If the opponent is a P-51 and you are not in a perfect position, do not engage, survive, and escape. That is the only tactic that works." The ground crews at Fusa were equally stunned. They disassembled sections of the Mustang, examining the construction with the meticulous care of surgeons. The engine mounts were precisely machined. The control cables were steel-braided and perfectly tensioned. The fuel system was self-sealing. The tanks lined with rubber that would close around bullet holes and prevent fire. Every valve, every bolt, every panel was manufactured to tolerances Japanese factories could only dream of achieving. Sergeant Watanabe, who had first noticed the lack of oil leaks, spent 3 days studying the engine cowling. "There is no wasted space," he reported to his superior. "Every component fits together like a puzzle, and nothing, not one single part, leaks." His superior, a colonel who had overseen aircraft production for 20 years, could only shake his head. "We have been building fighters with string and prayers," he muttered. "They have been building them with mathematics." But it was the equipment inside the cockpit that truly revealed the gap. The radio direction finder allowed the pilot to navigate by tuning into ground stations and following the signal. The gun sight was gyroscopic, automatically calculating lead for deflection shots. The oxygen system was regulated and reliable, allowing pilots to fight at altitudes where Japanese pilots gasped for breath. Even small details, like the quality of the plexiglass canopy, which did not distort or yellow over time, spoke to a level of industrial sophistication that Japan could not match. In late March, a captured American document was translated and circulated among senior staff. It was a training manual for P-51 pilots, and it included a maintenance schedule: oil changes every 25 hours, engine overhaul every 200 hours, expected service life of the airframe, 1,000 hours. Japanese fighters were considered worn out at 300 hours. Their engines needed constant maintenance, and even then, failure was common. The Americans were building machines designed to last. By mid-April of 1945, Major Kuroe received new orders that would transform his role from test pilot to prophet of doom. He was to lead what the Army Air Force called a flying circus, a traveling demonstration unit composed of captured Allied aircraft. Evalina would be the centerpiece. His mission: tour every major fighter unit in Japan and teach pilots how to survive encounters with the Mustang. It was an admission of defeat disguised as tactical training. The first stop was a Kano flying school, the elite training ground where Japan's best instructors prepared new pilots for combat. Kuroe landed Evalina on the grass strip as hundreds of cadets and instructors gathered to watch. The Mustang's silver fuselage gleamed under the spring sun, the red Hinomaru circles painted over the American stars looking almost obscene against the aircraft's obvious foreign elegance. Among those watching was instructor Yohei Hinoki, a legendary ace known as the iron-legged pilot. He had lost part of his leg in combat, but continued flying through sheer determination. More importantly, he was the first Japanese pilot to shoot down a Mustang. Back in November of 1943, over Burma, he approached Kuroe with the careful respect one warrior shows another. "Major General Imagawa asked me to master the P-51 and then demonstrate it to other pilots," Hinoki said. "I didn't have great confidence in my ability to fly such an advanced aircraft with my disabled leg, but I made up my mind to do my best." Kuroe led him to the aircraft. Hinoki circled it slowly, his practiced eye taking in every detail. "I could see the superiority of its equipment," he later wrote in his diary. "The shiny fuselage with the open red mouth of a dragon painted on the nose. I saw several red dots on the side of the cockpit, probably recording Japanese aircraft the pilot had shot down." He paused at those marks, each one representing a Japanese pilot who had died. With the radiator under the fuselage, it looked very sleek and deadly. It reminded me of the day I had first seen the P-51 in the sky above Burma. When Hinoki climbed into the cockpit, his artificial leg making the process awkward, he was immediately struck by the design. "The seat was roomy," he recorded. "I did not have any trouble with my artificial leg on the rudder pedal. Everything was positioned perfectly for comfort and efficiency." Kuroe briefed him on the controls, pointing out the various switches and gauges, all labeled in English but arranged with such logical clarity that the language barrier barely mattered. "Major Kuroe told me how easy the P-51 was to fly," Hinoki wrote. "At first I thought he was being kind, but when I took off, I understood. The aircraft practically flew itself." Over the following weeks, Kuroe conducted demonstration after demonstration at each airfield. The routine was the same. Japanese pilots would take off in their best fighters, Ki-100s, Ki-84s, even the imported Focke-Wulf 190 that Germany had sent as a symbol of Axis cooperation. Kuroe would wait until they were airborne, then climb into Evalina and follow. The engagements were not close. At one base, near Osaka, Captain Masatsugu Sumita and Lieutenant Nakamura took off in two Ki-100 fighters, widely considered Japan's best hope against the Mustang. The Ki-100 was sleek, fast, and maneuverable, with excellent visibility and reasonable armament. On paper, it could compete. In practice, the gap was devastating. Sumita and Nakamura started with altitude advantage, circling at 15,000 feet, while Kuroe climbed from below. They positioned themselves perfectly, the sun at their backs, ready to dive on the Mustang the moment it came into range. It should have been a textbook intercept, but Kuroe, flying with the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly what his machine could do, simply pushed the throttle forward and climbed straight through their altitude. The Mustang's Merlin engine, supercharged and perfectly tuned, pulled the aircraft upward with relentless power. By the time Sumita and Nakamura realized what was happening, Evalina was already above them. They dove after the Mustang, trying to use gravity to close the distance. Kuroe let them come, watching his mirrors as the two Ki-100s plunged toward him. Then, at the last possible moment, he pushed the stick forward and dove as well. The Mustang accelerated past 450 miles per hour, the airframe rock-steady even as the speed built. The Ki-100s, their lighter construction beginning to shudder, could not keep pace. Kuroe pulled out of the dive in a smooth climbing loop, bleeding speed with precision, and when he leveled out, he was behind both Japanese fighters. The engagement was over. In a real battle, Sumita Nakamura would have been dead. After landing, Sumita approached Kuroe with visible frustration. "We had every advantage," he said. "Position, altitude, numbers. How did you reverse it so easily?" Kuroe's answer was simple and devastating. "You need to remember your opponent's speed and climbing ability well. If it had been a plane of the same level, you might have won. But if the opponent was a P-51, that is what happens. Be careful." The message was clear. Against a Mustang, even perfect tactics were not enough. The machine itself was superior, and no amount of skill or courage could fully compensate. These demonstrations had a profound psychological effect on Japanese pilots. Many had believed the propaganda that portrayed American equipment as inferior, mass-produced junk built by soft, undisciplined workers. The Mustang shattered that illusion with brutal efficiency. Here was an aircraft built in the same factories that produced thousands of bombers, fighters, and transports, yet it was more refined, more capable, and more reliable than anything Japan's handcrafted, artisan-built fighters could achieve. The irony was not lost on the pilots. Japan had spent decades cultivating a warrior culture that emphasized spirit over material, fighting prowess over industrial capacity. The samurai tradition taught that superior will could overcome superior weapons. But the Mustang did not care about fighting spirit. It flew faster, climbed higher, and carried more fuel, regardless of the pilot's determination. One young pilot at Akeno, barely 20 years old, approached Kuroe after watching a demonstration. "Sir," he asked quietly, "if the Americans have hundreds of these, how can we win?" Kuroe looked at the young man for a long moment before answering. "We cannot," he said finally, "but we can make them pay for every mile they take. That is all that remains." The flying circus continued through April and into May. At each stop, Kuroe delivered the same lessons. Do not dogfight with a Mustang. Do not try to outrun it in level flight. If you are chased, use terrain and clouds. Dive toward the ground, where the Mustang's speed becomes a disadvantage. Brake hard and often to spoil the gunshot. Survive and escape. Those were the only tactics that worked. But beneath the tactical instruction was a deeper, unspoken message. The war was lost. The Americans possessed not just numerical superiority, but technological dominance. Every pilot who flew against Evalina understood this, even if they could not say it aloud. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By late May, Evalina began showing signs of wear. The generator, stressed by months of continuous operation without proper replacement parts, started to fail. During a routine flight from Taisho airfield, the electrical system failed completely, forcing Kuroe to make an emergency landing. He brought the Mustang down safely, but the damage was done. Without a replacement generator, and with no way to manufacture one that would meet American specifications, Evalina was grounded. Kuroe stood beside the silent aircraft, running his hand along its wing one last time. In 4 months, this single machine had taught Japan more about the war's true state than 1,000 intelligence reports. It had revealed not just American technological superiority, but the vast industrial gap that made that superiority inevitable. The Mustang was not an exception. It was the standard, and America could build them by the thousands. The plan had been to transfer Evalina to Akeno Flying School for permanent use as a training aid. But with Japan's infrastructure collapsing under relentless bombing, the transfer never happened. The Mustang sat at Taisho airfield through June and July, slowly deteriorating. Parts were stripped for study. The engine was disassembled and examined one final time. And then, as American forces closed in and the war entered its final weeks, Evalina simply disappeared. Some records suggest it was buried in a field to prevent capture. Others claim it was bulldozed into a lake. A few veterans remember seeing it pushed into a ravine and covered with earth. Whatever the truth, the physical aircraft vanished, erased as thoroughly as Japan's belief in its own invincibility. But the lessons remained. For Kuroe, the experience of flying Evalina marked a turning point. He had spent 4 years fighting for the Empire, shooting down Allied aircraft, teaching new pilots the way of the warrior. But the Mustang had taught him a different lesson. Wars were not won by spirit alone. They were won by nations that could build better machines, train more pilots, and sustain logistics across oceans. Japan had none of those advantages. It had only courage, and courage without resources was just a slower path to defeat. In his final report on the Mustang, submitted to Army Air Force headquarters in late May, Kuroe wrote with uncharacteristic bluntness, "This aircraft represents a level of engineering and industrial capacity that Japan cannot match. Its superiority is not marginal, it is fundamental. We are fighting an enemy who treats quality as standard and produces it in quantities we cannot imagine. This is the truth we must face." The report was filed and forgotten. By June, headquarters was too busy managing the defense of the homeland to care about one test pilot's observations. But Kuroe kept a copy, carefully folded in his flight bag. It was evidence of something he would carry for the rest of his life, the knowledge that he had touched the future and found it belonged to someone else. The American pilot, Sam McMillan, who had been shot down and captured on that January afternoon, survived the war. He was held in a prison camp north of Tokyo, enduring the harsh conditions that all Allied POWs faced in the final months of the conflict. He did not know that his aircraft had become a symbol of American industrial might, that it had been flown by a Japanese ace who came to respect it more than his own fighters. When McMillan was liberated in August of 1945, one of the first questions American intelligence officers asked him was about his aircraft. What had happened to it? Had the Japanese captured it intact? McMillan could only shake his head. "I landed it in one piece," he said. "After that, I don't know." It would be years before the full story emerged. Through declassified Japanese documents, interviews with surviving pilots, and the painstaking work of historians, the tale of Evalina slowly came to light. The silver Mustang with a woman's name painted on its nose had become a ghost story, a legend whispered among veterans on both sides of the Pacific. For the Japanese pilots who flew against it, Evalina was proof that they had been lied to. The Americans were not weak. Their equipment was not inferior. Every piece of propaganda that had sustained them through years of brutal combat was revealed as hollow the moment they sat in that cockpit and felt the power of American engineering beneath their hands. For American pilots, the story was different. It was validation, proof that the long supply lines, the massive industrial mobilization, the thousands of workers in factories across the United States had produced something genuinely superior. The Mustang was not just good enough, it was better, and that margin of superiority had saved lives. But perhaps the most profound impact was on one man, Major Yasuhiko Kuroe, the ace who had expected to find weaknesses and instead discovered excellence, carried the memory of Evalina for the rest of his life. After the war ended, he returned to his family's farm, trying to rebuild a life in a shattered nation. Food was scarce. Work was hard. The future seemed impossibly distant. In 1950, when the Japanese government began establishing the Japan Air Self-Defense Force, Kuroe was among the first pilots recruited. His experience with captured aircraft, his tactical knowledge, and his reputation as an ace made him invaluable. He trained new pilots on American-built aircraft, ironically flying the very machines he had once fought against. By 1953, he was commanding a squadron of F-86 Sabre jets, American fighters that were the descendants of the Mustang's design philosophy, sleek, powerful, technologically advanced. He flew them with the same respect he had shown Evalina, understanding that these machines represented not just military hardware, but a different way of thinking about war. In 1955, Kuroe was sent to Britain for advanced training with the Royal Air Force, one of the first Japanese officers to study abroad since the war. British instructors found him quiet competent, and unusually humble for an ace. During one conversation, an RAF wing commander asked him what it had been like to fly against the Allies. Kuroe thought for a long moment before answering. "We believed in spirit over steel," he said finally. "We believed that determination could overcome material disadvantages. And then I flew a captured Mustang, and I realized we had been fighting with one hand tied behind our backs, not because of cowardice or lack of skill, but because we simply did not have the tools." The British officer nodded slowly. "And now? Now I fly aircraft, built by the same people we once fought," Kuroe said, "and I am grateful for them." By 1960, Major Yasuhiko Kuroe had risen to the rank of Major General in the Japan Air Self-Defense Force. He commanded training wings, developed tactical doctrines for jet combat, and mentored a new generation of Japanese pilots who had never known war. To them, he was a respected elder, a man who spoke rarely but with weight. They knew he had been an ace in the old war, but he never bragged about his victories. Instead, when young pilots asked him what combat had taught him, he would tell them about a silver Mustang named Evalina. "It taught me," he would say, "that the best weapon is not the one that makes you feel superior. It is the one that brings you home alive." The story became legend within the JASDF. New pilots heard about the captured American fighter that had humbled Japan's finest aces. Some thought it was exaggerated, a cautionary tale meant to keep them humble. But the older pilots, the ones who had survived the war, knew it was true. They had seen Evalina, they had flown against it, and they had learned, as Kuroe had learned, that acknowledging an enemy's superiority was not weakness, it was wisdom. In the early 1960s, American and Japanese aviation historians began corresponding, trying to piece together the stories of captured aircraft on both sides. Through these exchanges, Kuroe learned what had happened to Sam McMillan, the pilot who had been forced to land Evalina at Suchin Airfield. McMillan had survived imprisonment, returned to Connecticut, married, and lived a quiet life. He rarely spoke about his time as a POW, the memories too painful to revisit. But when he learned that a Japanese general had flown his aircraft and come to respect it, McMillan wrote a letter. It was brief, formal, addressed to Major General Yasuhiko Kuroe, Japan Air Self-Defense Force. The letter said, simply, "I heard you flew my Mustang. I'm glad it served a purpose beyond the war. Perhaps it taught both of us something about the machines we trusted our lives to." Kuroe kept that letter in his desk drawer for years. He never responded. What could he say? That flying McMillan's aircraft had shattered his faith in his own nation's propaganda, that it had forced him to confront the reality that Japan had been outmatched not by better warriors, but by better factories. That every victory he had won in the skies over Burma and China felt hollow in retrospect, knowing that the enemy he fought possessed reserves Japan could never hope to match. Instead, he folded the letter carefully and placed it beside his copy of the final Evalina evaluation report, 2 pieces of paper, one from an American who had expected torture and received survival, one from a Japanese pilot who had expected superiority and discovered humility. On December 5, 1965, Major General Kuroe went fishing in a river near his home. It was a cold morning, the water running fast with winter melt. He was 47 years old, still active in the JASDF, still respected as one of Japan's finest pilots. His colleagues described him as a man who had found balance in life, someone who had reconciled his wartime service with his post-war duty. But sometime that afternoon, Kuroe drowned. The exact circumstances were never fully explained. Some said he slipped on wet rocks and was swept away by the current. Others whispered that he had simply waded too deep, lost in thought, and never fought against the water's pull. His body was recovered hours later, downstream from where he had been fishing. At his funeral, pilots from across Japan gathered to pay respects. American officers stationed at Japanese bases attended as well, a gesture of the alliance that had replaced enmity. One American colonel, a Mustang pilot during the war who had flown missions over Japan in 1945, stood quietly at the back of the ceremony. When asked later why he had come, he said simply, "He understood what we built. That deserves respect. Uh, Among Kuro's personal effects, his family found the two letters and a small notebook. The notebook contained sketches of aircraft he had flown throughout his career: Ki-44s, Ki-84s, Focke-Wulf 190s, F-86 Sabres. But the most detailed drawing, rendered with careful precision over multiple pages, was of a P-51 Mustang. Beneath it, in Japanese characters, he had written, "The aircraft that told the truth." The story of Evalina did not end with Kuro's death. Through the 1970s and 80s, historians continued searching for the aircraft's remains. Expeditions were mounted to survey lakes near Taisho Airfield. Fields were excavated, veterans were interviewed, but no trace of the Mustang was ever found. It had vanished as completely as the war itself, leaving only memories and reports. In 2000, aviation historian Henry Sakida published his research in Flight Journal magazine, finally identifying Sam McMillan as the pilot who had landed Evalina at Suchin. By then, McMillan was elderly and in poor health, unable to provide detailed interviews, but his family confirmed the story. Yes, he had been shot down. Yes, he had survived imprisonment. And yes, he had always wondered what became of his squadron mate's aircraft. Oliver Strawbridge, the pilot whose girlfriend's name adorned the Mustang, had lived until 1987. He never married Evalina. Instead, he married a woman named Ruth Ann and built a quiet life far from aviation. When asked about the aircraft years later, he would only say, "It was a good plane. I'm glad it came home, even if I didn't fly it." For the Japanese pilots who had flown against Evalina during those demonstrations in 1945, the memories remained sharp decades later. Masatsugu Sumita, the Ki-100 pilot who had been outmaneuvered so thoroughly, recalled in a 1998 interview, "Major Kuroe saved lives by showing us the truth. We learned to respect our enemy's machines, and that respect taught us caution. Caution kept some of us alive." Yohei Hinoki, the iron-legged ace who had flown Evalina despite his disability, wrote in his memoirs, "Sitting in that cockpit, I understood for the first time that we were not fighting equals. We were fighting an industrial colossus with the spirit of warriors. Spirit alone is not enough when your opponent has both spirit and superior tools." The legacy of one captured aircraft rippled across generations. In modern Japan, Air Self-Defense Force training, instructors still reference Evalina when teaching young pilots about respecting enemy capabilities. The story has been simplified over time, reduced to its essential lesson: never underestimate your opponent's technology. Never let pride blind you to reality. These principles, learned at such terrible cost during the war, became foundational to Japan's post-war military philosophy. In the United States, the story took on different meaning. For American aviation enthusiasts and historians, Evalina represented the validation of American engineering prowess. Here was proof that the billions spent on aircraft development, the millions of hours in factories, the countless design iterations had produced something genuinely world-class. The Mustang was not just adequate, it was exceptional. And that excellence had been recognized even by the enemy. But there was also a quieter, more profound lesson embedded in the tale. Sam McMillan had expected torture. Instead, his aircraft became a teacher. Yasuhiko Kuroe had expected to find weaknesses to exploit. Instead, he found excellence to acknowledge. Both men had their expectations shattered, and both, in different ways, were changed by the experience. The war had been full of hatred, brutality, and propaganda on both sides. Japanese soldiers had committed atrocities. American bombers had incinerated cities. Both nations had dehumanized the other, creating narratives that justified increasingly horrific violence. But in the story of One Silver Mustang, there was a moment of unexpected truth, a moment when a Japanese pilot sat in an American cockpit and thought, "This is better than what we have," and had the courage to say so. That honesty delivered in official reports and tactical briefings, may have saved lives. Pilots who learned from Kuroe's demonstrations understood that survival meant avoiding engagement when possible, using hit-and-run tactics, and never underestimating the Mustang's capabilities. Some of those pilots survived the war because of that knowledge. In the decades since, aviation archaeologists have continued searching for Evalina's remains. Modern ground-penetrating radar has surveyed the areas around Taisho airfield. Lakes have been drained and explored. But the Mustang remains lost, buried somewhere in Japan's earth or submerged in its waters, a ghost that refuses to be found. Perhaps that is fitting. Evalina was never about the physical aircraft. It was about what that aircraft represented, the collision between propaganda and reality, the moment when belief met evidence and shattered, the slow, painful acknowledgement that courage and skill were not enough when the enemy possessed superior tools and the industrial capacity to mass-produce them. For viewers watching this story unfold across decades and continents, the question remains, what do we do when our beliefs are proven wrong? When the narrative we have been taught, the worldview we have built our identity upon, crumbles in the face of undeniable evidence? Kuroe's answer was to adapt, to learn, to carry the truth forward, even when it was uncomfortable. He spent the rest of his life flying aircraft built by the nation he had once fought, teaching tactics developed by former enemies, and serving in an alliance with the very people who had defeated Japan. That required a flexibility of spirit far greater than anything demanded in combat. Sam McMillan's answer was to survive and move forward. He returned home, built a life, and carried the memory of his capture quietly. He did not seek revenge or hold grudges. He simply lived, which in itself was a victory. And Evalina's answer, if an aircraft could answer, was to teach, to be a bridge between two nations, two philosophies, two ways of thinking about war and technology. The Mustang's message was simple. Excellence speaks for itself. It does not need propaganda or exaggeration. It simply is. As the sun sets on this story, we're left with images that span 75 years. A silver Mustang landing at a Chinese airfield, its pilot terrified of what comes next. A Japanese ace climbing into an enemy cockpit and discovering uncomfortable truths. Young pilots gathering to watch demonstrations that would save some of their lives. An American prisoner surviving in silence. A Japanese general drowning in a river. His thoughts forever unknown. And somewhere, buried beneath Japanese soil or water, the remains of an aircraft that changed minds more effectively than any bomb. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.